Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking with Professor Austin Sarat, and we're going to get into a lot of your work. First off, Professor Sarat, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I wanted to have you on the podcast primarily to talk about an article that you wrote in March called It's Time to Acknowledge America's Constitutional System is Broken and Begin Building a New One. And I also thought we could weave in another one of your articles, Coping with Constitutional Ignorance and Alienation, as well as perhaps touching on your work around the death penalty, which is where you've focused a lot of your time. But first, I was hoping you could introduce yourself.
So I teach at Amherst College. I've just completed my 50th year at Amherst. I teach in political science and in an Amherst department called Law, Jurisprudence, and Social Thought.
How did you develop your interests? How did you arrive at Amherst and find an interest in the things you've written about?
I did my graduate work at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I specialized in legal matters. I pursued at an early part of my career those same kind of interests. A job opened up here for someone in political, looking for somebody to teach law within political science. And I applied, was fortunate enough to get the position, and 50 years later, still at it.
I wanted to turn to your article, It's Time to Acknowledge America's Constitutional System is Broken and Begin Building a New One. And I wanted to read a chunk of how you conclude the article. You conclude with, and this is your quote, "If we survive the current crisis, the first step on the road to recovery will involve acknowledging that the existing Constitution can neither cope with the new political and technological developments that have brought us to this moment, nor prevent the rise of authoritarianism and tyranny. We must stop clinging to the belief that we can respond effectively to that crisis and emerge with the existing arrangements intact. Only then can Americans get down to the hard work of imagining a constitution that can adapt and improve democracy and the rule of law." And you conclude, "That imagining will also help inspire action and build alliance with millions of Americans who have been telling pollsters that they want radical change." So I'm curious, why did you decide to write this article and what are you really trying to get at here?
People in the present moment who are trying to preserve or improve American democracy have turned themselves into defenders of a status quo that many Americans find wanting and no longer satisfactory. In the presidential election of 2024, Vice President Harris tried to rally the nation in defense of democracy and the rule of law. And she lost. No, she lost by 1.5 percentage points. So it was not a landslide, but she lost. One of the reasons I think she lost is Americans want change, and she promised continuity. So I think that people who are dedicated to the rule of law and the preservation of democracy need to take on the very difficult task of looking at our constitutional arrangements and trying to refresh them, renovate them, reform them. Our Constitution is notoriously hard to amend, and the last amendment is decades old. So I think we need a new moment of constitutional imagination rather than clinging desperately to the imaginings and thoughts and beliefs of people who wrote a document more than 2 centuries ago.
It occurs to me that during this period that we're going through, another response that I've seen a lot of is the opposite of what you're saying, is to sort of double down on what we have and say, this is what we really need to latch onto. Is there something that pushed you or led you to this position of actually we need to analyze what we have and really question this foundation that we have?
So the American Constitution, among many things, is premised on the idea that we will have separation of powers and checks and balances. That system of separation of powers and checks and balances seems to me in the present moment not to be working. What the founders imagined is that the people who populated each branch of government, the judiciary, the Congress, and the executive, would jealously guard the prerogatives of their branch. They would think of themselves more in terms of a congressperson then I'm a member of any particular faction or any particular political party. What we've seen is that that imagining is really broken down, that members of the Congress tend to behave more as members of a political party than they do as guardians of the prerogatives of the branch of government in which they serve. And the strains now being put on the courts in the United States to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law are enormous. No one ever assumed that it would fall finally to the courts in the United States to resist executive encroachments on constitutional values one day after the next. So I think we're seeing a kind of failure of the constitutional system to work in practice. And we might imagine that it can be repaired rather than reformed. But I think to preserve rule of law in the United States, we have to think about new arrangements.
In your article, you cite another article by the dean of UC Berkeley Law, Erwin Chemerinsky. And Erwin says, we're living under a flawed constitution. Let's start fresh and change it. You've touched on this a little bit, but what's the significance of the dean of one of the country's top law schools calling for a new constitution? And how did we get to this point? Perhaps even, in your own case, what's the significance of you writing this article?
Let me mention another law professor, a Yale law professor named Jack Balkin. Balkin several years ago wrote, I think, a really provocative article in which he distinguished constitutional crisis from what he called constitutional rot. And Balkin argued, I think, right on the money, that the United States has been suffering from a long period of constitutional rot. And I think that people who study the Constitution, understand the Constitution, understand Balkin's point. So it doesn't surprise me that the dean of the law school at the University of California, Berkeley, would acknowledge that we really need to refresh our constitutional commitments. Years ago, scholars talked about the Constitution as being America's civil religion. But today, millions of Americans are disaffected. They want, as you said earlier, radical change. Now, that doesn't make their desire for radical change correct. And figuring out what radical change would improve the performance of American government is going to be a Herculean task. But I think that we proceed at our peril if we ignore the voices that are saying our form of government needs radical change.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about reading your 2021 article, Coping with Constitutional Ignorance and Alienation, I pulled out a bit from this article, and it might not in any way support my question, but you write that coping with constitutional ignorance, or excuse me, that's the name of the article, in Coping with Constitutional Ignorance and Alienation, you write that our leaders need to do more than offer praise for democracy. They must take care to explain why our constitutional democracy is worth fighting for, and they must take up that fight every day. Something I've been interested in reading, for example, the work of Erwin Chemerinsky, but also folks like Ziblatt and Levitsky, two Harvard professors who wrote most recently a book called Tyranny of the Minority, is trying to suss out if ideas have changed amongst people who are writing about the Constitution, including yourself. So I was curious if your thinking about the Constitution has changed since writing this article in 2021, or changed perhaps over the course of your time studying these issues?
The short answer to your question is yes, though the time frame of my change in thinking predates that article. Like many scholars and citizens, I was very surprised by the results of the 2016 presidential election. More surprising to me were polling results that antedated that election that suggested widespread alienation of Americans from our democratic institutions. So here's one example. A survey done in 2015 asked Americans, quote, how essential is it to live in a society governed democratically? How essential is it to live in a society governed democratically? The people who did that study then broke out the results by age cohorts. People born in the 90s and 90s roughly 75% of them said it was essential to live in a society governed democratically. People born in the 90s or after, the number was roughly 25%. So attachments to the Constitution and democracy are much greater among people my age than they are among the students that I teach. Now, there's much about the Constitution that I admire, but there's much about the Constitution that I've come to see needs updating, reform, and being refreshed. And I think that the election of 2006, everything that's happened since, has been a wake-up call that simply saying we need to hold on to the Constitution as we have it may no longer be enough. Look, let me be clear about what you started with. In the immediate moment, we need to do three things. First, we need to preserve the Constitution. We need to preserve the idea that no person is above the law. We need to preserve the idea that all government officials need to respect this basic law. Let's say that that's responding to an emergency. When the house is on fire, you need to put the fire out. You don't think in that moment about, well, how can we remodel? That comes next. So that's the second stage. If we preserve the constitutional arrangement and move beyond the present emergency, the second step is to think about how we are going to go about rebuilding the infrastructure of constitutional democracy in the United States. And that'll mean thinking about things like the massive income and wealth inequalities in this country, and how do we respond to them. That'll require us to think about how can we reimagine government in a way that it is more efficient and effective. And the third step in this is what I call the need to think democratically, to think democratically. And that's something that we can all do in our daily lives. What does it mean to think democratically? It means to tell the truth as you know it, but to tell it so it can be heard by someone who doesn't already agree with you. What does it mean to think democratically? It means to be curious about views that are different from your own. What does it mean to think democratically? It means to not rush to righteousness and condemn. Empathy first before criticism. So that's a kind of three-step for me in thinking about how do we respond. Preserve what we have. The house is on fire. Once we put out the fire, how can we remodel our constitutional home? And in the meantime, how can all of us practice the virtues of democratic thinking?
I wanted to ask about your students. This isn't a question that I had originally sent you, but I feel silly forgetting it because I always like to ask professors this question. What you notice your students are talking about, the people who are in your classes, the people who are attending universities. I'm also curious what the academic community is talking about. But you mentioned this poll, for example, citing changing ideas. What do you notice your students are talking about in regards to these topics?
So I'm about to violate one of my primary principles, which is don't generalize about students. So if you'll forgive the violation of that principle, I'm going to generalize about students. The students I teach seem to me to be caught between despair and hope. They've grown up in the era of Donald Trump and the paralysis of American government. They've grown up in an era in which if you go to a hospital emergency room, you may wait 6 or 7 hours for treatment. They've grown up knowing that if you call a cable television provider or a wireless company for service, you may spend a frustrating hour or two on the phone trying to get them to understand and acknowledge your problem and then to do something about it. They've grown up in an era of political paralysis in Washington, D.C. So that's the despairing part. Hope, many students are deeply committed to causes, to social justice causes. Gender justice, racial justice, environmental justice, despair and hope. Now notice what I didn't say, and that is that they are deeply committed to democracy. The students I teach, they're not hostile to democracy, but if you ask them about their primary commitments, democracy doesn't come to the top of the list. So people like me have to reintroduce a generation of students to the virtues of constitutional democracy against their own experience that constitutional democracy hasn't performed very well.
I'm curious, and again, I suppose this would be a little bit of a generalization. If the students who you're discussing were to define democracy, how you think they would discuss it? Would democracy for them be a government that's responsive to the will of the people, one person, one equal vote? How do you think they understand this thing that perhaps isn't coming to the top of their mind?
Well, again, I don't think this is a problem of students. If you ask people why democracy is valuable, and you exclude Winston Churchill's answer that it's the worst of all possible governments except for all the rest, my students, and I dare say many Americans, could not give you a very good response. They would say something like, because it allows people to participate. And that's like saying democracy is good because it's democratic. So my students, and I think, as I said, many Americans, don't have a very good grasp of the virtues of democratic and constitutionally democratic forms of government. It's easy to say, again, that there are a generation of students who did not grow up with civics education in the schools, but what they experience is they experience democracy as noise making. Democracy is people shouting at each other. Democracy is people accusing each other of this form or that form of bad behavior. So I don't think they can give a very good account of democracy, but I don't think that's simply a problem of the younger generation.
I'm going to conclude soon by asking you about the death penalty and your work on the death penalty. If you'll forgive me, though, there's one other question that's coming to mind that I didn't
Sure.
initially send to you. The 250th, and I'll just say this is one that I'm wanting to ask pretty much all my guests these days. The 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence is going to be next year, 2026. And I'm curious what you think can be done around that, how this period how that period can be used, if you will, to further the conversation around what you talk about in your article, around it's time to acknowledge America's constitutional system is broken and begin building a new one. I imagine we're going to get a lot of discussions saying how great is what we have now and that has existed for almost 250 years, instead of having the conversation around the title of your article. But how can we engage in that?
Well, anniversaries tend to be celebratory moments. You don't celebrate your wedding anniversary by saying, let's get divorced, let me find a new wife. So the celebration of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I suspect, will be just that. It'll be a celebration of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence holds out a principle, which principle I don't think needs to be reformed or discarded. I think it needs to be embraced. And that principle is that, well, it says all men, but we've learned all persons are created equal. And the commitment to political equality is basic to the value of democracy and the enterprise of building a constitution worthy of that commitment. So the Declaration of Independence, despite the Declaration of Independence, does not require democratic government. All it requires is that the people consent to whatever form of government they would like to, and that form of government respect their inalienable rights. I think that the celebration of the Declaration of Independence, to the extent that it elevates the value of political equality, offers a platform for us to think about how do we realize the value of political equality? How do we make it real in a society where there is so much social inequality, in a world in which the United States Supreme Court has said money is speech and flooded the political process with money? So I think we can celebrate the Declaration of Independence and focus on one of its central teachings, which is that we're all equal politically, and use that as a platform to say, if we're going to realize that commitment, that understanding, what do we have to do, both in the way our government governs day to day and in the architecture that supports it?
I wanted to close out by asking you about your extensive work on the death penalty. As a side note, the first real political thing I got involved in was around solitary confinement. So I feel some sort of an affinity towards this criminal justice angle, if you will. But what I'd like to know is how your analysis of the death penalty connects with these questions of democracy, universal and equal rights, and perhaps even with the question of the Constitution and laws at the federal level.
Well, thank you for asking. I think the death penalty is fundamentally incompatible with the commitments of democratic politics. And let me explain to you what I mean. Democratic government is a form of government which is committed to the possibility of reversal. No decision is final. We have an election, and then 4 years later, we have another election. We pass a law, we don't like it. We pass another, we take that off the book and pass another law. And when a death sentence is handed down, it's handed down in the belief that what someone deserves at the moment that that sentence is handed down is what they will deserve out into eternity. That means that a death sentence is a kind of display of arrogance in judgment and is fundamentally incompatible with the democratic spirit of reversibility. And if you look closely at the way in which the death penalty works in the United States, if we move from this abstract plane of whether it's compatible with democracy or not, and examine the way it works in the United States, I think what we see is that the death penalty system in the United States is quite broken. And it is functioning in a way that is an insult to central constitutional values. So what do we know about the death penalty system? We know that in the guilt phase, trying to decide whether they're guilty of a crime, many, many mistakes are made. Innocent people are convicted. That's an affront to the commitment to due process of law. And then when people are convicted and move on to the sentencing phase, we know that race plays a very large factor in whether people get a death sentence. You're much more likely to get a death sentence if you murder a white person than if you murder a person of color, regardless of the race of the offender. And that's an affront to the American commitment to equal treatment under the law found in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And then we move to the phase at which people are actually executed. And what do we know? We know that many executions are botched. The most frequently botched method of execution in the United States is the one that we currently use the most. That's lethal injection. And when executions are botched, that's an affront to another constitutional value, the Eighth Amendment's commitment that there shall be no cruel punishment. So if we look at the way the death penalty system works in practice, it seems to me to damage American constitutional values. That's a reason to oppose it. You can oppose the death penalty because you desire to preserve and honor the values of due process of law, equal treatment under the law, and no cruel punishment. And also say that the death penalty is fundamentally incompatible with a commitment to democratic politics.
To close out on this last of the last questions, where does the conversation around the death penalty stand these days? Are these ideas that you're talking about creeping into the discussion? Are they a large part of the discussion? Curious about that.
The United States is in a period of national reconsideration of capital punishment that would have been unimaginable 3 decades ago. So in the 90s, we were giving out about 300 death sentences a year across the country. Last year, it was in the 20s. In the 90s, at the high point, we executed 98 people in a single year. Again, last year, it was in the 20s. The more Americans see the death penalty in action, the more they reject it. And they're rejecting it on grounds that the machinery of death is broken. Support for the death penalty is down. More people today in national surveys say they prefer life in prison without parole as a punishment for murder than the death penalty. And if you actually look at where the death penalty is being used, it's being used in fewer and fewer places. I mean, we say that Texas has the death penalty. Well, in truth, the death penalty is on the books in Texas, but most places in Texas don't execute anyone. California has a death penalty, or they have a moratorium on executions, but very few places in California sentence anyone to death. So increasingly, it is the case that the United States doesn't have a death penalty. Fewer and fewer jurisdictions have it and are using it. I mean, many states that have the death penalty on the books haven't executed people in a decade or more. So you end up with a false count if you simply count the number of states that retain it on the books. It's a very different picture if you look at the states that actually use the death penalty. So this is a period of national reconsideration, which I think will end up over time leading to the abolition of the death penalty everywhere in the United States. And again, I don't want to seem wildly optimistic. That process will take place 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We'll make progress and then we'll regress. But I think the direction of change about the death penalty is very clear, and I think it's irreversible.
It's interesting. It sounds like there are a few areas in which there are new national conversations around things. And perhaps one thing that ties them together is this question of democracy, universal and equal rights. Do we have punishment systems that reflect those, political structures that reflect those, so on and so forth? It's an interesting period.
Yeah, I think you're right, but I do want to just differentiate.
Sure, sure.
I think the more people examine the functioning of American democratic institutions up close, the way they actually work, the less they like them. And that's the same thing with the death penalty. The more people look closely, the less they like it. Well, that might lead to the abolition of the death penalty, but hopefully the disillusionment of Americans from the operations of America's democratic system doesn't lead to the disillusionment and ending of American democracy.
Austin, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. I'm definitely going to share your two articles.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for your interesting and thought provoking questions.